Hey, welcome everyone to the AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG monthly book chats. I'm delighted to have Mark Windschitl here joining us. Um, and we're going to introduce him in just a second. I want to just talk a little bit about what we're going to be doing over the next few months here. Well, there's Mark's book there. This is the book we're going to talk about today, Teaching Climate Change. Fostering understanding, resilience, and a commitment to justice. Our upcoming talks are next month next year, actually. In January, we'll have John Rudolph, Why We Teach Science and Why We Should. In February, we'll have Edna Tan and Angela Calabrese-Barton with their book, Teaching Towards Rightful Presence in Middle School STEM. And in March, we'll have Antara Tutivakunda with Black Campus Life, the world's Black students make at a historically white institution. And that one is about engineering education. And then as you can see there, we have them scheduled out now through June. We'll take a break in July and August, and we'll come back in September 2024 with some more. We're very excited to add Danny Morales-Doyle's Transformative Science Teaching, a Catalyst for Justice and Sustainability. So again, I hope everybody who has been able to join us. So again, we're going to be talking about Mark Windschitl's Teaching Climate Change, Fostering Understanding and Resilience, and a Commitment to Justice. And let me turn off this screen here. There we go. Okay, Mark is a professor of science teaching and learning at the University of Washington. He's the co-author of Ambitious Science Teaching, and it's my real delight to welcome Mark to the AERA Science Teaching and Learning Chat. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to be here, and thank you, especially those of you in the East who are coming in late in the day. So thank you.
All right. Well, thanks. So I think I sent you these first couple questions. We'll just get started, and I want to just let people know that they can. And I apologize for the barking dog in the background there. I'm not sure what's going on, but we'll deal with it. Mark, I'd like to start by asking if you could just give a brief description of your book for anyone who hasn't read it yet.
Okay, this is always a tricky question because I could just go down, the table of contents. But let me put it this way. So in the first chapter, I wrote about this metaphor of an educator wanting to really deeply understand climate change and the human response to it and the human impacts of it. And I likened it to going into this huge, dark museum where you're the only person in there, and there are no signs that point you in any particular direction. There's no docent to tell you, oh, just go over, start here, and then go over there. This is the best path for you. And so you really lost. And that's how I felt a few years ago when I was thinking about the book, and I thought, what can I do to help a reader navigate all the ideas that are involved in climate change, and then also develop a sense of climate consciousness, not just understand all the little exhibits that you got to visit, but understanding the whole thing and being conscious of the whole thing, which includes seeing the big picture, the science, but also the solutions, social justice, human ideologies, this crazy, surreal thing of there are multiple possible futures that lie ahead of us, and they really depend on choices that we make now. That has always been the case. That's how time flows. But choices we make now more than ever are going to have a huge impact on all the generations that follow us. Impacts that are, in many ways, I always hate to say this, but they will be irreversible. And so there's a lot of gravity to the book, but there's also a lot of joy. I followed 3 teachers, 3rd grade, a 7th grade teacher, and a sophomore through a unit of instruction. And I got to visit with their kids. I got to see artifacts of their work. I got to interview kids. And to me, that just enlivened a few of the chapters in the book. And and gave us, I think, gave me hope as I was visiting the classrooms and writing it up. So
Thanks.
that's where I am, and I want to just thank those teachers, the Molly, Carolyn, Jessica, and some others, Nellie and Nicole. You know who you are.
Yes.
Aaron, Colleen.
Well, thanks. And I think that the work of the teachers really does come through in the book. And I think one of the, you know, it's not obvious to somebody who might just be looking at this book on a shelf, but this is really 4K, you know, it's not just a high school book, book for high school teachers. It's really like, I think one of the things I like about it is that climate change is seen as this thing that can be done across, you know, the educational, you know, journey from, you know, very early childhood up through adolescence and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think some of the people attending today know that I was one of the co-authors of Ambitious Science Teaching. And that was actually originally written to support pre-service teachers at the middle and high school level. So we envisioned all this ambitious discourse and creating models and revising one's thinking and working with data over time, developing explanations. We were surprised after just a year or two, we had second grade teachers contacting us, third grade teachers. We had a kindergarten teacher who came into our doctoral program, and I was absolutely blown away by what the teachers of our youngest kids could do. So I learned my lesson, and in this book, I tried to include this third grade classroom just to show people what is possible. And to tell you the truth, this audience probably doesn't know this, but when we started writing about ambitious science teaching, there were a few reviewers of our research papers who said, I think you're making some of this up because I don't think that very young kids can engage in this kind of sense-making dialogue. And so we actually had to battle that. And so I think there's lots of people in attendance here who are nodding and saying, we know better. So yeah, it was wonderful working in that third grade classroom.
Well, thanks. So this next one might be a bit of a softball, but I want to give you an opportunity to talk about it. So what was your motivation to write a book about teaching climate change? And particularly, you know, the book that you wrote, what led you to actually undertake this project?
Well, first of all, I had to get up the nerve to write this book. And that's the first part of the story. A few years ago, when I started to get the news every day was about climate change, you know, and when you start subscribing to certain kinds of newsletters related to the climate or anything else, you start getting more incoming, not just newsletters, but the system knows that you're interested in that topic. And so I was getting inundated with different kinds of ideas and technologies and stories about the human dimension of climate change. And I thought that I have to write about this. But at the same time, I was just so afraid of the scope of climate change. Imagine the hubris of thinking a person could write about climate change and all of the human dimensions and political dimensions that go with it. And so there was a time when I would get up in the morning and I would sit on the edge of the bed and I'd draw a deep breath and I would ask myself, can I really do this? And I was afraid. You know, the Ambitious Science Teaching book it sells a lot, people love it, but I thought I'm in a completely different kind of water here. And so this was my constant companion for years. I use this in my scholarly writing class. This is self-doubt. In my writing class, I tell my students, he will always be with you.
Yeah.
And he was throughout the writing of the book. So I wrote it. Sorry, Doug. I was going to say, I wrote it so that teachers could feel like they could gain a foothold on a really complicated topic. And they could see not just the particulars, but also see the big picture after going through some of the chapters. They would develop that sense of climate consciousness, a more total awareness of all the things that are going on, and how they're connected. And so one thing I did early in the writing of the book was I said to myself, I'm learning so much every day because I was reading just volumes of material and I was listening to podcasts. I mean, every time I went outside and took a walk, I put the earbuds in and I was listening to yet another podcast. So I was inundating myself in ideas and literature about it of all kinds. And so I told myself, I have to remember how I'm thinking about this now, because pretty soon I'll know much more, I think, than the average educator does. And I'll lose track of who my readers are. And so I always have to go back and think, how was I thinking a couple of years ago? And I need to write to that audience. And the name of the first chapter, some of you know, is The Leap. And the book is written in part so teachers feel comfortable taking the leap, going from a very caring, compassionate, competent educator to the same kind of teacher, but you're introducing climate change, climate solutions, regeneration, resilience, that always have to go together, introducing that into your curriculum, K-12. So that's why I wrote the book.
Well, I'm wondering, so, I mean, you talk about I appreciate you sharing that piece of self-doubt, because I think it's important for, especially, I know there's doctoral students in the audience who might be thinking about like their own work, do I have the right to even write about this thing? And I mean, knowing that never goes away, and that's part of, doing scholarly work, I appreciate you mentioning that. I'm wondering about, so in ambitious science teaching, there's equity is all throughout that book. Equity and fairness and is all throughout there. But this book takes it to another, like there's another level to it, right? And it's not a partisan dimension, but it is political in the sense that like politics is how we organize ourselves as humans, and that has to change if we're going to have an inhabitable planet, right? Like, and so I'm wondering about that. Was that a component of the fear as well? Because I think that's what a lot of teachers feel like, I don't want to get in trouble, or there's some sort of like the fear of the unknown of what's going to happen if I take this leap. Like what are the consequences if I become the type of person who talks about climate action?
Yeah, I mean, there's no avoiding it, because the history of, to understand climate change, you also have to understand the history of how did we get to this place in the first place. And that is a history of colonialism, oppression, racism. And we know that there are stories that have come before the climate change story. Hazel Johnson, who is been called the mother of the environmental movement, it's an African-American woman in Chicago back in the 1960s. She was working on all this politically because she was living in a place called Altgeld Gardens in a suburb of Chicago, and it was redlined to be only for people of color, primarily Black Americans. And she fought and fought to get these landfills removed. There were something like 60, within a third of a square mile, there were something like 60 toxic containers buried underground, if you can imagine that. And she got them all removed, and she created a movement. So there is a legacy that precedes the climate change legacy, which is the environmental justice. And so we are borrowing ideas from that legacy. I'm probably going sideways on your question here, Doug. Do you want me to step back and
we can take this wherever you want to take it, Mark. I was thinking we could talk a little bit more, a little back and forth, but if people want to put questions in the chat, and we can load up a couple questions while you and I are talking, and then we can, people can ask their questions as we go.
Sure.
I know we made a specific plea to people to come with questions for Mark, whether you've read the book or not, or you've just looked at the website, or well, I think, so in chapter 2, you have this phrase in the vision for climate change teaching. You said we have to acknowledge to students that 2 levels of explanation, scientific and justice oriented, are necessary. And it seems like that's kind of what we're talking about here too. Yeah, I grant you go into detail in the book, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that part, about the explanation part, the justice-oriented explanation, the scientific explanation when, someone's
Well,
going to teaching climate change.
yeah, for natural scientists, their ultimate goal, sorry, did you say something, Doug?
No, we had an unmuted microphone. I'm going to mute some folks here just for good
Okay.
measure. All right, you're good.
Okay, remind me what you just said, Doug, so I can pick up my.
We have these two levels of explanation: the scientific and the
Yeah.
justice-oriented explanations.
Yeah. So the goal for most natural scientists is to develop causal explanations for why things happen the way they do. And that is emulated in a lot of K-12 classrooms because that's one of the most complicated intellectual work that kids can do. And all the other scientific practices feed into building explanations and models. But if we just take a look at climate change phenomena just existing at the scientific level and not the social level, we're missing half of what's happening. So I use the example of urban heat islands. Many of us know that you can go to the New York Times and see they've got lists and lists of stories about urban areas all around the country, dozens and dozens of them, where, again, mostly people of color have been redlined into certain areas of town, and those areas of town are not green. They're covered with concrete, asphalt, other impervious surfaces. They're not near bodies of water. And this is due to, as I said, redlining, which began in the 1930s. So that has got to be part of the explanation for why it is so hot. And it can be up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in one part of town than another part of town. That is a huge difference. We all heard this summer how hot it was in some places that people would fall on the sidewalk, they have that accident, but they would get second-degree burns from coming in contact with the asphalt or the concrete. It can get really hot. But the scientific explanation involves the electromagnetic spectrum. It involves infrared radiation being absorbed by surfaces and re-radiated, so on and so forth. But underlying that is the gentrification, block dusting, redlining stories that began, as I said, in the 1930s. That's why it is so hot there. You have to have both levels of that explanation.
Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking back to my first year of teaching. I got in trouble, Mark. It was the 40th anniversary of Brown v. Board of Ed, and I put up a little sign on at the front of the room. Actually, it was on the door, and we were 4 miles away from a school. We were primarily all white at my school, and 4 miles down the road was a school that was all black. And it was kind of like my do now for the day. And another teacher that I shared the room with complained, not to me, but to a vice principal. And I got told I had to take that down because that wasn't part of science teaching. And I'm wondering what I imagine there's little versions of those sort of passive aggressive, conflicts occurring all throughout classrooms and schools in the United States around the issue of climate change. I'm wondering, this wasn't a question on my sheet, but I'm wondering how you think about that in terms of, some of the themes of the book and how a teacher, whether they're a novice teacher or they've been in the classroom 30 years, who wants to take up these issues for the first time might start thinking about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, it's a challenge, and every teacher knows their community better than anyone else, and they know their kids and they know their parents. And so they know the kind of risks they're taking when they introduce ideas that other people might think, well, that's not part of science. But it's hard to teach about climate change in a truthful, honest way to kids when you're not talking about social justice, when you're not talking about indigenous worldviews that should be considered epistemically on at least in concert with Western science. We have to start introducing those things. It is possible. There are some teachers who are starting to teach about climate change, but they don't mention that phrase. They use sustainability throughout the curriculum, even though their kids totally know that climate change is a thing and it's happening and it's going to impact them. Kids have, they have phones and they see stories about climate change every day. In the chapter 1, I call that the shadow curriculum. It's everywhere for kids, and they know. If they don't talk about it, their friends talk about it to them. And so teachers do have to address that. And I guess one of the important things they have to address with them also is emotions, their emotions around climate change. So you have climate anxiety, which is a forward-looking emotion. It's kind of a soup of, I would have to say, negative emotions in which you're really worried in a deep way about what's going to happen to you and everybody else in the future. And then there's eco grief, which is kind of a backwards looking cluster of emotions. And so there is a lot of good research out there about how to talk to kids about their emotions. There are 5 or 6 findings that are all pretty consistent about how we might do that, but it's still scary. I was just talking to I just taught a graduate class using the book that we're talking about tonight. And I modeled how you might talk with kids about their emotions. And I had 2 or 3 students in the room say, oh, I would see a problem with this. My kids in my school would be upset with this, or I don't know how to handle this part of the conversation. So we all have to learn to do these things, handle the political piece of it and handle the emotional piece of it. And teachers, and I hear you saying this, and I'm one of you, I was never trained to do any of this, never trained. So there's good places to look for help on how to handle emotions, for example. That is one chapter in the book. I think it's chapter 9 that I would have, no, chapter 10. I would have written more expansively about how to talk to kids about their emotions. But I did create a website that is a companion to the book. And I think, Doug, you have already put that in the,
I'll put it in the chat right now.
Yeah. And
but I'll share it in the email after as well.
Yeah. So when I was writing the book, I had literally thousands of resources, and I could not write about all of them in the book. So what I did was I organized just a few that are just really core good things to read. Sometimes they're graphics, sometimes they're videos, but I organized them in this companion website because I always think teachers should use this book not as the last book they ever read about climate change. It might be the first book they ever read about climate change, but once they read this, they know I'm going to start reading about this because I have a little gap in my knowledge about this, or I'm going to read about that. And so that's part of my intention too, that this book act as a springboard for teachers.
It did that to me today, Mark. I left going, why is methane absorb so much more IR? Like, why is it 85 times more of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide? And I was looking at IR spectra by, that an hour later, and it definitely did that for me. We have a couple questions. Some are private to me, some are in the public. So Rich Del Vecchio from Hackensack, New Jersey, you are up.
All right. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right,
Yep.
great.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Windschitl. I have a question. So I'm a 5 to 12 science supervisor of a city of about 50,000 people. I'm also a doc student at Montclair State University with Dr. Larkin. So going back to the urban heat island effect, and also in the book, like in pages 124 to 126, you talk about the redlining with the tree canopy in Richmond. And we're doing a similar project where the students are looking at the tree canopy in the city and the practices by which it has disappeared. So very interesting. We go into Google Street View, and they can go right in front of their house. And there's a feature, I don't know if everybody knows about this, you can go back in time, sometimes upwards of 12 years. And you can go back to 2008 and they see all these trees in front of their house. And then you go up to 2022, and in most cases, a lot of them are gone. And they might be gone because of disease or old age or whatever, but the kids are very interested. So at the end of the day, we're doing a study on, where those trees are and where they're not. And in our city, it seems that the redlining practice hold true like very clearly. So moving forward, we're going to do the study again. And what I expect is that the students are going to find some practices that now we can bring into the social justice realm, but also into that nonpartisan politics piece, and perhaps write a letter to the Shade Tree Commission, who we're also working with, and say, hey, we would like, and let the students come up with a statement, we'd like to recommend this. So I'll get to the question right now. But so our city is undergoing major redevelopment, and I'm feeling now that the word of this project is getting out that the city developers are looking at this and saying, what kind of data are you going to put out there? And you know, like the students are going to voice it in terms of race and class. And that's kind of what we want them to do, is to take ownership of that and look at those forces. But I'm wondering, like, do we bring that data to the, this is the question, you know, for me, I'm wrestling with, do we bring the data to the town council and let them kind of work with us, or let the students show what they show and really get kind of messy in the politics? I don't know, you know, what your experience with that has been. I know you touch on it a little bit in the book.
So your question is, do you bring like raw data and have the council look at it with a little bit of input, or do you do analyses of the data and you kind of represent it in the ways that make your point to the council? Is that what you're saying?
I think that if the students bring the data to the council, it's going to show elements of structural racism, even if this town council isn't responsible for it. And you know, I'm worried that they might not take the best actions because they're worried about the politics involved, rather than maybe giving an executive summary ahead of time and then throwing the ball in their court and letting the students engage in that process. I mean, do you think we bring the students in on that process, or, you know, like the amount of buffering and brokering in that process?
Boy, you're asking a non-political person. Everybody's political, but I am as much a novice at doing this, I think, as most people are. I think I would bring data, and I would bring the kind of data that you can't really dispute. You're going to show differences in temperatures that exist dramatically in different parts of town, and that how that correlates really highly with the presence of certain kinds of communities around the town. And I would lead with the data for sure, and then draw conclusions after. I wouldn't start with conclusions. I would lead with data. Data is always super helpful, and depends on what kind of data. This is a good example where kids could develop data fluency by using certain kinds of data to present an argument to another group of people who may not be familiar with that data. A great data fluency exercise, in addition to being a component of social justice. And I would make the kids aware, if you're going to talk to the kids about solutions, because you shouldn't just talk about the problem, you should also offer solutions, but you should make the kids aware that solutions always come with trade-offs. Could we plant more trees in these redlined areas? We could, but people on the council will say, but it will cost, or it's going to displace X or Y. So think about anticipate the trade-offs ahead of time. Because anytime you teach about solutions, you should also teach about trade-offs.
Excellent.
And I haven't spoken very much about solutions here, which is, I'll just tell everybody, if you haven't read the book, there is as much or more science in the solutions of regeneration and resilience as there is in all the natural science, the ecosystems, the carbon cycle. There's as much or more in the solutions.
Thank you.
Yes, that I don't know if I addressed your question perfectly well, but
no, it's very good.
Okay,
I can run with it.
All right.
So I want to talk about solutions, but I also see there's a couple in the chat here. Sarah, did you want to? Is that, I don't know if that's a comment or a question or just something we can talk about. Sarah Michaels, do you want to?
Yeah. Hi, Mark. It's great. It's really great.
Hi,
to
Sarah.
see you, and I so appreciate what you've done. And I also have read the book in with two different groups of people. And it's really clear to me that the book needs to be read slowly and in conversation. And I think thinking about how to support teachers to read this in concert with allies and parents and colleagues, or, you know, and support them with that. And I hope that the website will, will provide some of that. Yeah, I wanted to talk, I've been spending a lot of time with teachers and teacher educators who teach in places where you cannot use the word climate change. You can talk about global warming anyway, where you're really beginning to see the fascism that is slowly creeping or increasingly creeping in. And the question of supporting, creating mechanisms of support for teachers who are often the most vulnerable in this, the teacher educators and the academics are far less vulnerable than the teachers, and particularly teachers of color, and who understand the importance of this. So I just wanted to open up the conversation to people here who are struggling and worried about being silenced, or fearful that they will say something. And anyway, I'm hoping people here can speak to some of this, the kind of courage it takes, and the kind of support from the rest of us that it's going to take.
I was just in a conversation with colleagues from our Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction here in Washington, and they referred to the difference between presenting climate change ideas in Western Washington, where it's pretty democratic, and then on the eastern side of the mountains, it's more conservative. It's purple, I would say. And they told me that people can often feel talked down to by liberals and people who are environmentalists or otherwise just believe in climate change, and that it needs to be not just taught, but action has to be taken on it. We don't want to talk down to our fellow citizens. And so we have to find ways to honor their way of thinking and be patient and recognize the ideas that they do have. And just genuine listening is really important. And so in the classroom, what that means is you have to develop a culture of open-mindedness in the classroom rather than indoctrination, because that's what a lot of people fear climate change enthusiasts are going to do, is indoctrinate kids. We don't want to do that. We just want an open-minded ethos in our classroom where people can bring data, they can bring facts, they can bring lived experiences, and we'll have a conversation about it. But I'm just not going to lecture to kids that I have all the answers. I'm just going to present data. Kids do respond to data. There are a number of studies that show that students who are relatively unconvinced about climate change, when they do get involved with looking at just raw data, not complicated data displays, but just data like what has been the percent of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 800,000 years, or what's the temperature been, or the ocean, the top 100 meters of the ocean, what's that temperature been over the last few years? If they just look at the very basic data, it does help move the needle. But you can't flip ideologies or motivated reasoning, what psychologists call it. You can't flip it like a switch, unfortunately, and we shouldn't be thinking that way. It's an imperfect answer, Sarah, but I think it's the best we got. I don't know.
Thanks, Sarah. Mark, I wonder if we can go a little further with that. So like the whole book is rooted in a specific vision of science teaching and learning. And you said you just taught this grad course about teaching climate change. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what you think a classroom in 2023 or 2024 that's teaching climate change, what it looks like. Because I think there's still some, that indoctrination piece, I think, is still part of that public understanding of science education that might be wrong.
Well, I'll share a screen with you and just to give you the big picture of how I'm thinking about it. So climate change is a big sprawling puzzle. It's the entanglement of all kinds of different natural and social phenomena. So at the very left side, the very basic part of climate change is the amplified greenhouse effect. And of course, it's brought on by fossil fuel emissions building up in the atmosphere. I think we all know the story that's on the left side. And a lot of teachers, including a lot of science teachers, think that this is the core of climate change, when in fact it includes a lot more than this. This is perhaps why in a number of different national polls, teachers report saying that I don't teach climate change because it's not in my subject area. And it may be because they just view climate change as the greenhouse effect. But it's more than that, because that warming affects nearly everything that sustains life. And you can see in that second column, we are talking about chemistry, we're talking about biology, we're talking about physics, all kinds of things, in addition to the larger earth science type courses that might be taught. And then there are all the human impacts, because you don't get to human impact really until you understand the first two columns. Then you can see what's happening to human beings, and disproportionately people of color, disproportionately people in the global south. That's another thing I think all of our kids by middle school should understand, how we refer to the global south and how they're disproportionately affected, despite having carbon footprints that are a fraction of what we have in the global north. And then there are solutions. And this is a wonderful story. I usually don't say the word solutions too often. I use the words regeneration and resilience, because solutions are not really an all at once flip the switch and you fix something in its entirety. There's no such thing as that. The other diagram that I share with teachers who are thinking about, does this fall in my wheelhouse? I show them this diagram. And this is just under the theme of everything is connected in climate change. So on the bottom right, you can see that there's environmental justice and activism, there's governance and the civic exercise, the democratic freedoms. So our social studies teachers should feel like, I can team up with my science teachers and we can do something that's a collaborative between our two subject matters. And then here is the artwork, the study of literature. It is so moving to see what people are writing, including youngsters are writing in terms of like climate fiction and spoken word poetry. It is amazing. So bring in your art teachers, bring your English language arts teachers. And then there's, of course, there's a science, there's a biological systems, there's solutions, there's all kinds of earth system changes. And then there's the socio-emotional well-being, which none of us can ignore. So I use these two diagrams to try to convince teachers that there is a place to teach about some aspect of the climate change story in every part of the curriculum. And again, I've dodged your question, Doug, but that's okay.
That's fine. I'm gonna, Andy, we're gonna save Andy's question towards the end. Dan, would you like to ask your question? I'm happy to ask it for you if you're not in a position to hop on.
I think that's me, right?
Yep. Hi.
Yes, that's my question. I'll just read it. So in your chapter on disinformation, you talk about students learning to find and evaluate information sources, referring to climate change, but I'm assuming also generally as a crucial goal. And then on the call, you also brought up incorporating indigenous knowledge systems with Western science ideas. And I'm wondering, how do we balance talking about credibility and trust in Western climate science and scientists, which has sort of these mechanisms for, producing reliable knowledge, while also acknowledging that other knowledge systems that might be useful for thinking about these problems have different ways of establishing credibility of their knowers and reliability of their information, and sort of like, and therefore needs to be evaluated on its own terms. And how do we? It's quite complicated thing to do. So I'm just curious if you've thought about those ideas and how we do that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would forward you to two authors that I think do a pretty good job of explaining this. One is a former colleague of mine here at the UW. Her name is Megan Bang, and she wrote something like, if Western scientists will stand with us, how will they, blah, blah. I can't remember the whole title, but if you look at Megan Bang's recent work, there's something about Western science and indigenous sciences working together. And we refer to it as indigenous sciences, not indigenous knowledge. The reason is because indigenous science suggests that it's still being developed. It's still underway, just like Western science. It's not set. It's not settled. So So she talks about the complementarity, how one can work within another and not supplant the other. We don't need indigenous knowledge to supplant Western knowledge, nor the reverse. Indigenous knowledge is known for some things, like the intimate knowledge of the context within which living systems exist, and even geological systems. Indigenous scholars of their science know the landscape, they know the organisms and the ecosystems there and how they function in greater depth than typically Western scientists do, because they try to make generalizations across many different kinds of ecosystems in many different places. So that's one way in which indigenous science can inform Western science. And I won't go any further than that because it is not my area of expertise. I just wanted to let readers know that this is something that they should look into. And I have those in the citations in the book too, that people can read further. So Megan and Kyle White is another KYLEWYWHYTE. He's another indigenous scholar and scientist.
And I've also put a link to the fantastic report that Daniel and Jonathan Osborne put together on science education in an age of misinformation.
Yes.
I just put that in the chat too. It's fantastic. So
yeah, you wouldn't believe how much disinformation is out there. It is unbelievable. It's the Heartland Group, PragerU, Petro. I wrote about Petro Pete in that chapter. You should go look up Petro Pete. We watched it in my graduate class a couple of weeks ago. It's a curriculum, fancy, shiny curriculum made by the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Company, and teachers, they need curriculum, so they use it, but it's all about Petro Pete, who wakes up one day and all his petroleum products are gone, and he thinks it's a nightmare to live without petroleum products, but there's no mention of climate change.
Thanks. Helen Meyer, would you like to ask your question, or I can read it out loud if you can't hop on camera?
I'm not gonna, I don't know if you can hear.
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead and
Okay, I'm not gonna hop on camera.
that's fine.
So I've been working with my pre-service teachers who, as I have gotten older, seem to be getting younger by, like they are minutes older. I do secondary science. And they're still struggling with consolidating their own content knowledge. We do very little earth space science, even though they have integrated licenses. And for a lot of them, social justice issues have only really been something they've experienced. They've been pushed on them, they think sometimes, in college. And so it's tried to get them to nudge them forward on this. And, I've done some place-based learning with tree canopy. We actually did heat items and tree canopy. We did bird counts. They did neighborhood bird counts and then related it to, but they really are struggling. And then to send them out to schools that are frequently openly hostile. They're so young. I don't know. I don't feel like I was ever as young as they seem to be. So I'm just like, what are some of the hopes, or what are some strategies or places that can give them some courage to try?
I will let somebody else, if they want to, who may have done this. If we have pre-service educators here, does anybody else want to respond? And I have brutal wait time, by the way.
And Anthony has his hand raised, but I think it was for a different question. But we can just feel free to unmute if you want to answer Mark's redirect.
Yeah, hello. I am not. I actually do not know what to do about it. So I think I'm a little different. It's an honor to meet you all. I'm sorry that my camera's not working, but I'm actually a college professor in the Department of Education and was given this link because I'm actually teaching a climate justice class in education in the spring here, and just wanted to reach out to other like-minded people. And I'm glad that this is K through 12. I really didn't have a question other than I just wanted to tell Mark and all the rest of you that I'm so happy to be in community around these issues, because as an educator who was brought up, I got my PhD in education, and my whole work really deals with trying to make the case that in the Department of Ed, we need to talk about these things, you know? Yeah, it's just really great to see it finally happening, and I can't wait to read the book, Mark. So yeah, I just wanted to pop on and say thank you.
You partially answered Helen's question, I think, even though you may not have thought so. I was talking to Doug before our Zoom started, and I said, no matter how the conversation turns out tonight, we will have had a few dozen people together in the same virtual room talking about climate change solutions, social justice, and the history of how we got here and how we might teach it. And that is still rare. That is still rare for people like us to be in the same space and talking about this. And so, Helen, I guess my message is that more and more, there will be conversations that support your efforts to teach your pre-service teachers, and those pre-service teachers will hear about climate change. Hopefully in the future, they'll hear about it at the undergrad level in multiple classes, not just a single class, but undergrad coming up. They're going to be secondary or elementary science teachers. They should hear about this in an inclusive way. And so yours may not be the first class where they hear about this, nor how to teach about it. And the models should become more widespread. I know the models for teaching are not very widespread at all. I keep telling people say, Mark, give me a great curriculum. And I'd say, we are at the very beginning of learning how to teach about climate change. We are just starting. The research is so minimal. It's good research, but there's so few examples of it. And it's going to grow. We'll have influence. It'll be us. We have to take. It's going to be us. Nobody else is going to work on this problem. It's got to be us.
Mark.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Amal, and I actually wanted to share my experience and then just talk to Helen. So I'm a professor, assistant professor of science education, doing work around climate justice in Florida. And just to talk to Helen about, I want to tell you first to give yourself grace. This is my second year doing this with both pre-service elementary teachers and in-service elementary teachers. And every time I do this, I realize that it takes time, that this is a process, and that you really need to make it contextual to your students, and that there's going to be a lot of iterations and revisions as well. I'd be happy, you can reach out, and I'd be happy to share my experiences doing work, climate justice work in Florida, but it's possible. It's just, it's a process is what I am definitely learning from all this.
Thank you, Amal. Mark, I think one of the things, and this relates to Christine's question, so I'll use this as a lead-in. But like one of the things that, like the affective, emotional nature of teaching climate change, you referenced that already, but like it was evident in this book in a way it's often not in the science ed literature. And there were a number of places in the book where you talked about like just striking a balance or threading a needle, that difference between somebody used the term eco-grief before, not doom scrolling or going overboard with doom. Can you just sort of talk about this tension a little bit, and then we'll let Christine, if you're able to unmute and ask your question, we can roll from one right into the other.
Yeah, when I was writing the book, some tensions came up for sure, just a pull from two sides. And one of those tensions is you want to be honest with kids about, number one, the severity of the situation that we're in. Things are accelerating and in the wrong direction. We can see how kind of feeble our political leaders are, and how they lack any kind of sense of humanity about climate change for people, you know, impacts on people other than themselves. Our political leaders seem to be quite well buffered from the worst effects of climate change so that they're not too concerned about it. So there's that. And then on the other side, we have to encourage them. We have to help them cope with the emotions that come along with these realizations. And so what the research says pretty clearly is that students never get rid of negative emotions like climate anxiety or eco-grief. It is a matter of how do you teach them to cope with the grief or the anxiety. Anxiety is actually correlated with a lot of different things, some of which are positive and some of which are negative. I'll give you an example here. These are all the things that climate anxiety is positively related to. It's positively related to the rate of exposure a person has to information about climate change. The more information they get, the more anxious they are. The amount of attention people pay to climate change information around them, also that is related to their climate change. But also it's positively related to their pro-environmental behavior and participation in climate protests, which is a kind of pro-environmental behavior. And the research says that engaging in some type of activism, even the smallest actions, help students, young people, cope with climate anxieties. So it's delicate. We're just learning how to work with these emotions in class. And you can't talk to kids about their climate emotions every single class period. So you have to think about what are those conversations going to be like on the first day of the first unit of instruction that you teach. Maybe the first 2 days are going to be about how do you feel about this? And there's some good recommended books like this one for people who teach young kids, All the Feelings Under the Sun by Leslie Davenport. I don't recommend specific products, but this one I do. It's great for young kids. And it makes a big difference if you're talking about kids 6 years old and younger, or between 6 and 12, or between 12 and 18. Those are 3 developmental levels where you have, and this is on my companion website, you have to treat those 3 groups of students differently. And again, you can see that on the website. But for the very young kids, you don't get into climate change with kids 6 years old and younger. They just can't understand the scope, the gravity, the abstract nature of it. But what you can do is build that critical value of nature, that nature is valuable in and of itself. And you cannot endlessly extract resources from it. Humans are not exceptional. They are simply one more cog in that people work in reciprocity with all the other organisms, plants, animals, microbes. To build that kind of biocentric sense in young kids is a precursor for them having more sophisticated climate knowledge as they get older. It's a very positive thing for our teachers of our youngest kids to do.
Thanks. Christine Bernhard, would you like to, I don't know if you can unmute, but would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. And you answered quite a bit of that. I was formerly a high school STEM teacher for 15 years and am now working with in-service and pre-service teachers. And I found that when I was teaching, it was really easy to get hung up on like just teaching the facts of climate change. And you want kids to know the science and you want them to understand the data and be able to interpret the data and apply the data. And my kids would leave my class and say, you know, I just feel so depressed now. And I found a hard time. I found it very difficult to mitigate that. And now as I take a step back and am much more immersed in the research, you know, seeing things that teachers have done that are focused more on action, but trying to think about how could I have applied that in my setting. And I don't know that I would have been able to. I think I would have gotten a lot of pushback. So I'm wondering if you have tips for teachers and those of us working with teachers that can help move classes towards localized action to inspire hope and, you know, a feeling of really like working towards a solution and solution seeking instead of just teaching kids the facts. And if you've seen a lot of examples of those localized efforts really take hold.
Yes. So Christine, are you familiar with, I'm talking about solutions now. Are you familiar with the website drawdown.org?
I'm actually not.
Okay, so look on drawdown.org, not now, but after, and you will see they have a library of probably over 100 solutions. We show when we're able to, we show kids the drawdown.org website, and their eyes just pop out with all the different possible ways that you can do regeneration or resilience with the environment. And so one of the few things that's clear from research about teaching about climate change is focus on solutions. Don't focus on the problem first. Think about, we're going to enact this solution, and then we need to know the underlying science that caused the problem that we're trying to solve in the first place. But focus your unit on solutions, because there's plenty of science and technology, plenty of STEM in the solutions. And then also try to make that as local to your community if possible. If you can find a problem that your community is concerned about, then that's really the best. And maybe it's urban heat islands. That's why we use it as a good example, because it's local to a lot of people. And then it also has global implications. So focus on solutions, pick something that the community is concerned about that is a climate related problem, and then see if whatever you do in the community can have global extensions or global implications. And
Thank
that's
you.
not that doesn't ensure success, but I'm saying those are the things, some of the few things that we know have tended to work in instruction with kids.
Thanks. We're almost at the end of the hour, but Andy, I promised we would save your question towards the end. Would you like to unmute and ask? You're still with us?
Yep, sure, no problem. Thank you. Hello, Mark. Good to see you again. Andy Boyd, Wenatchee, Washington, North Central ESD. Just wanted to see if there's some pieces that are on the floor that didn't make the can and the cut, and you would wish that you would have kept in the book, or that you wanted to research more and left out, or what are some of your current things that you're thinking about that you want to add maybe to the second edition, perhaps down the road?
Oh my God. You're giving me a heart attack, Andy, talking about second edition. Oh my God. Well, like I was saying earlier, if I could expand one chapter, I would make a whole chapter on just discussing emotions and primarily coping, learning to cope, because it is a set of skills. And by the way, if anybody wants a resource, a really good resource on talking to kids about climate change and coping, you should look up Force of Nature. It's by Britt Ray, W-R-A-Y. She's in the UK. And by the way, the UK and Europe in general is quite a bit ahead of the United States in thinking about climate change solutions and talking about publicly about climate change. That's something I learned from doing all that reading. But Andy, I don't know if I would change anything. The stuff I would add, but there wasn't space, I put it all on that companion website. Yeah. So I've dodged your question too, but it's true.
Thanks, Mark.
Companion website, yeah.
Well, on behalf of the AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG, I'm really grateful to Mark for spending this hour with us. And clearly there is an appetite to continue these discussions and to have some sort of community around teaching climate change. And you know, I hope that there's wisdom in the crowd, and I'm sure there's some people who are looking for their climate action, and there's one sitting on the table for you to organize science educators to do this work. And so, Mark, I want to thank you for writing the book and for taking the time to spend with us tonight. I will do my best to capture all the links from the chat and put that along with the video link for the recording in the follow-up email. Any final words, Mark? Any parting thoughts?
I don't think so, other than it's us.
Yes.
Nobody is coming to the rescue. It's educators are a huge lever, and then we can pull a big lever of influence in this country. There are 70 million school children in our public schools. We have them, or our students have them, for 180 days a year. if we can just move the needle a little bit towards climate change teaching, some teaching at most grade levels, and do an excellent job of that, we can move that lever. And then other people in society are in charge of other levers, but it's us.
And it's a good a note to end on as any, because it's a charge almost to us, right?
Yeah.
We're the ones we've been waiting for.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We will have some great news about our AERA Science Teaching and Learning SIG that we'll share at the next book chat. We're doing something kind of cool for our reception. I'm just going to tease it now, but I will say that we have rented out a museum for 2 hours. I won't tell you which museum, but we're gonna meet in Philly, and I hope that many of you are making plans to join us in as low a carbon footprint as possible to get to Philly. I know Mark and I were talking about that ahead of time. Sometimes these national or international conferences come with pretty high carbon offsets that are needed. But thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful holiday, and we'll see you in the new year at the end of January. Take care, everybody, and thanks again, Mark.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Nellie and Nicole.
All right, I'll hang on for just a minute in case anybody wants to just chat.
I just wanted to say hi.
Courtney!
How are you?
Good. I didn't say your name, but I read your text out to my class. I was so excited.
Oh, I love it. I know. I really like it there. We're having fun. I see
Bye.
Kevin and Anthony every
Oh,
day.
I heard you guys were closed today, right? You flooded out?
We had a emergency closing yesterday, so the kids all found out an hour before.
Oh my
So
gosh.
they were bouncing off the walls. And then, yeah, we got the call, and I was like, I didn't think I'd be excited for the snow day phone call as an adult.